Thanks everybody for coming this evening. I'm delighted to welcome everybody to this timely lecture, What Free Speech is For, by Dr. John Thrasher, one of the most insightful contemporary voices in political philosophy and in the interdisciplinary field of philosophy, politics, and economics, commonly known as PPE. My name is Lee Strang, and I'm the director of the Selwyn P. Chase Center for Civics, Culture, and Society, the host of this evening's event, in collaboration with the Center for Ethics and Human Values and the PPE program itself. This collaboration leavens our university's conversation. Professor Thrasher's topic and his distinctive philosophical approach will certainly enrich our university's ongoing discussion about the relationship between civic life, moral psychology, and the institutions that sustain a free and open society. This event and its topic exemplify the center's mission of citizenship education well lived. Like all human communities, from a family to a civic organization or a religious organization to our nation, we haven't always lived up to our high calling. And it's important that we, in our day-to-day work at events like this, build our civic muscles to live well together. Stepping back for a moment, many Americans today feel uncertainty about the health of our civic institutions. Political polarization remains high, and confidence in the legitimacy and fairness of our political processes is often contested. What sustains political legitimacy in moments like these? What helps diverse citizens cooperate, tolerate, and live together peaceably despite profound disagreements? These are precisely the kinds of questions that Professor Thrasher I was listening to a biography of Margaret Thatcher. Professor Thrasher has spent his career investigating. Professor Thrasher holds a PhD and an MA in philosophy from the University of Arizona and a BA in philosophy from the University of Colorado. Most recently, Dr. Thrasher taught at Chapman University, both in the philosophy department and in the Smith Institute for Political Economy and Philosophy. And prior to that, he was a tenured lecturer at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. The author of dozens of articles, Professor Thrasher is the co-author with Gerald Gauss of the widely used textbook, Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, which many of you, if you were first here, were able to get a copy of. And for the first two student questions asked, we'll get copies of Professor Thrasher's book. He's also the co-editor of major volumes on social contract theory, strategic justice, and the philosophy of Peter van der Scharf, among many others. Professor Thrasher, I'm happy to say, is a returning Buckeye, having grown up in Ohio before moving west, both west to California and west to Australia. He's currently a visiting associate professor of civic thought at the Chase Center, and I'm delighted to share with you that Professor Thrasher will be a permanent Buckeye starting this fall of 2026. In his lecture today, Dr. Thrasher will speak for approximately 40 minutes, leaving 15 minutes for your questions and comments. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Thrasher.
Okay, thank you, Lee. Okay, thank you. So I'm very delighted to be here. As Lee said, I'm originally from Ohio, so it's a great kind of honor to be here in this library giving this talk, especially on such an important topic, especially at this time. And so when Lee asked me to give this talk, I don't know, roughly a year ago, maybe a little bit more than a year ago, there were all kinds of thoughts running through my mind about what I wanted to talk about. It's obviously a huge topic. There's many things you could say about free speech. And over the last several months, last year, the last weeks, the last days, many things have happened, many things have changed in our country, in the state, on campus, that have made me kind of just think, I don't know if differently, but like have changed my emphasis in many respects on what I'm thinking about. And so hopefully some of that will be reflected in the talk today. That's my goal, at least. Okay. Oh, I'm using the laser. Oh. Okay, so the talk is what free speech is for, and I'm going to talk about a couple different aspects of that in the talk. I'm going to start with some cases. So the first case is one that I just kind of found out about not too long ago, actually, although it happened in October. It's a case of a guy, his name's John Doe, not his real name. So he was a man in Philadelphia, and he had read an article in the Washington Post about some Afghan translators who their temporary protected status, I guess, was being removed, and they were being deported back to Afghanistan, or at least that was the threat. And he was upset about this, having been a veteran himself, and so he emailed the lead attorney, I guess, at the Department of Homeland Security, and just had a 4-line email that said, I don't think this is a good idea. The Taliban's not to be trusted. Maybe we should reconsider this. Well, after that happened, his Google account was subpoenaed by an administrative subpoena, and then agents showed up at his door to question him about the email that he sent. And since then, many of you may have seen, even today in the news, there was an article about this, about the explosion of administrative subpoenas that have been used against Google and other places to get emails for people who have been critical of the administration. So that's one example. Another one you may have also read about is Ramziah Otzerk, who was a Tufts PhD student. She still is, I think, in child development. And she had written an op-ed with I think 3 or 4 other students, basically about human rights concerns in the Gaza war. And after this happened, fairly recently, her visa was revoked, her student visa was revoked, and she was taken off the streets of Boston by masked men and then taken to a detention center in Louisiana for 45 days. Now for writing an op-ed. And that's the reasoning that's been given for this. Another case, very different in some respects, but similar in others, is the case maybe you may have heard of Dorian Abbott. So he's a professor at the University of Chicago, planetary science, and he was asked to give a prestigious lecture at MIT on planetary science. And during the time between when he was invited and when he was supposed to give the talk, there was a Twitter campaign that emerged that was attacking his views that he had been vocal about, criticizing hiring on the basis of race in terms of the DEI policies of the faculty. Now, these views had nothing to do with his underlying scientific views, and the talk had nothing to do with DEI, but over time, due to increased excitement about this on Twitter and other places, MIT eventually caved to internal pressure and decided to disinvite him. So he did not give the lecture. He did end up giving the lecture elsewhere, but that's not the point for today. Now, one reason why I bring up these cases is partly because they're timely, and partly I'd seen them recently, so I was thinking about them, but also partly because oftentimes in the United States, especially when we think about free speech, we tend to think about it in the context of the First Amendment of the Constitution. And rightfully so. We have one of the most powerful protections for free speech in law anywhere on earth. I used to live in Australia, where I taught, as Lee said, and they don't have a First Amendment in Australia. And it's noticeably different in the way that they think about freedom of speech. In Britain, you've seen very rapid changes recently in terms of the free speech environment. So I commend the First Amendment, I'm a fan of it, but there is more to free speech than that. And one thing I thought was interesting about these cases is that they don't seem to necessarily run afoul of the First Amendment, but they do seem to be cases of the chilling of freedom of speech or restrictions of freedom of speech in our country. Now, in the second case, apparently a federal judge has said that her First Amendment rights were violated, but I'm not sure if that will hold up. We'll have to see. So it's not obvious to me that they would have been, given the latitude that the Secretary of State has in these matters. So what's the point? Well, the point is this, that even if we take the First Amendment as granted, and we even say, we construe it very broadly, as I think it has been largely lately, we can still think about lawful speech that can still be chilled within that framework. And we can think of lawful restrictions of freedom of speech that can also be used in an overbearing way. That is, it might be perfectly legitimate in a lawful way. That is, it might be consistent with the First Amendment for the government or for an agent or someone to use, or a university to use their power in a particular way, but it might still be overbearing in a way that's not consistent with some of the underlying values or norms in the background. And so, and social pressure as well. So I guess what I'm trying to get at in this talk is to think about what those underlying values and the structure of them are, so that we can start to think about, whether or not we think these are good policies or these are good actions in certain kinds of cases. Okay. So I'm going to transition a bit from the real world cases, although we will return to them, to talk about some. I'm a philosopher. On my union card it says philosopher. That's where I got my training. And so we're required to use thought experiments and intuition pumps, as we call it, in our argumentation. So that's where we're going to go next here. So away from the real and into the kind of imaginary and hypothetical. So I'll give you two versions of this. Because oftentimes when we give arguments for the freedom of speech and why we think it's important, we typically focus on what you might call the epistemic benefits of freedom of speech, or the benefits that we get from having a diverse point of view, a bunch of diverse points of view, because we learn from them, or we can argue with views that we end up thinking are false, we can understand truth better. That all makes a lot of sense. But that's not the only arguments in favor of it. And I wanted to highlight that by thinking about cases where that's not going to be true. So imagine, after the revolution, we've we've instituted justice. Everything is as it should be finally. History has finally ended, and we can now kind of breathe a sigh of relief that we no longer have to struggle together. In this circumstance, do we need free speech anymore? What would be the point of something like free speech? Now, of course, maybe you don't like the idea of a revolution, and maybe you don't like the idea of a Maoist one, like as I'm suggesting, but you can imagine a good version, whatever your version of the just and perfect world looks like. Once we've established that world, why do we need freedom of speech anymore? Do we need it anymore? And I just ask you to think about that briefly. I'll give you a different version. Maybe you don't like my Maoist version of this. So imagine a case of a genie that comes to you in the middle of the night, and she says, or he, if you don't like this version, says, okay, as everyone's sleeping tonight, all of your neighbors, everyone all over, let's say the country, maybe the state, maybe the world, they wake up in the morning. I will give you this option, I will give you this wish you can have. They will wake up in the morning and they will believe everything that you believe. They will agree with you politically or religiously or ethically or whatever it is that you're concerned with. They'll believe the same thing that you believe, basically. And not only that, but they will think that they have good reasons for believing what they believe, and they will have some kind of story that they can tell themselves about why their views changed in the middle of the night, that they had some kind of eureka moment, in a dream or upon waking or something like that. And when they wake, they will all agree with you. So the question here is, would you take this wish? Would you accept this wish? Is this something that you would want? And if you think that makes sense, then you should think about why, or why not. Because to me, this is kind of a troubling possibility. It's like, why? There's things we can talk about this, but I think the point I'm trying to get at is, why would we want any kind of dissent if we were convinced that we had the right view of things? That's what I'm trying to get at here. So we'll come to some other examples here in a second. Okay. So the puzzle, this is like what I've been trying to get at here in a couple different ways, is why should we think that freedom of speech is important for ideas that we know are wrong? Not for ideas that we think might be wrong, but we're not like 100% sure about, but ideas that we know 100% are wrong, okay? Or we think we do, right? We think we've figured these things out. And so like you can stipulate whatever the example is. Maybe flat earth notions or something like that. Maybe they're wacky like that, but maybe something less controversial in some sense. And so we have a list of answers for why we should care about these things. And these are what I would think of as kind of the typical answers. I've kind of maybe constructed them in slightly different ways, and I'll go through each one briefly. So one might be is that you forget why you're right. That is, you've taken this wish from this genie, or the revolution has ended, and you no longer have any kind of dissent or any kind of difference in agreement and opinion. But over time, while you still have the same views, you don't remember why you hold them. You don't have good reasons for them anymore. They become a kind of dead dogma in a way. So that's like what I'm going to call like the million answer, or that's 1 million answer. I'll give some more explanation. Another might be that like we need this process of contestation or disagreement to generate new ideas, and that's an important a part of like generating truth. One aspect of that might be the kind of view that Karl Popper, I think, pushes a lot, which is that we're wrong about all different kinds of things, but we don't know exactly what those are, and so we have to kind of come head to head before we can figure that out. Another is something about the nature of political life in a free society, which I'll talk about as the Madisonian type of answer. And then the one I'm kind of come to at the end is something that's a little bit deeper. It has to do more with the character of the person involved, and I'll get to that one at the end. Okay, so we'll start, and I'll just talk about each of these slightly briefly. I'm sure some of you will be familiar with them, some of you won't. So I'll just kind of make the case, rehearse it so that we can go through it. So the living doctrine point is the first one that I'll talk about, which I think, again, I'm kind of labeling the million answer, and this is a new edition of On Liberty that's edited by our own Piers Turner, who's somewhere in the audience, and so pick that up if you get a chance. And you'll notice there's two authors on this edition. So what the Millses say is that even if you're right, as I said earlier, you still need to kind of constantly exercise that muscle to make sure that you know why you're right. And you need to be able to do that in a real live environment, not in a kind of simulation. So in one sense, that's what our classrooms aim to do. If you have a kind of Socratic approach, or you're challenging the ideas of the students, or we're challenging each other in various ways, that's one thing that we're trying to do. So we forget why something is true. It does seem that over time we seem to forget various things. Like it does seem that if you go through a number of generations, old ideas keep coming back around that maybe we thought were once gone. So maybe there's something to that. And then the larger point is that these points become prejudices rather than like legitimately held beliefs that we have reasons for justifying our knowledge of. So I'm sure we've all seen versions of this where you can kind of recite the conclusions, you know the catechism, but you don't really know exactly the reasoning behind it. And that's important in a lot of these cases. And so one reason we might want to still talk about these issues, even if we think they're wrong, well, we still might want to have dissent and disagreement, is to keep the issue living, if for no other reason, just to make sure that our own beliefs are kind of active and ready for defense in some fundamental sense. So that's one argument. And there's a lot more going on in On Liberty than that, but that's one part of the argument that I think is important. So you might still think, even though you know something is wrong, that we should still talk about it at least occasionally or allow some kind of dissent on that issue just for that reason. Now notice that the benefit here is to us, right? To the people who already have the correct views by stipulation in this story, which is interesting. The next view, we want to call the marketplace views, a marketplace of ideas, which is it comes from, Mill, this idea in some ways. But part of the thing that I think about this notion about the marketplace idea is that we don't take it seriously we don't take the analogy seriously enough in some sense. Like we should think of it as a real marketplace. And if we do, it changes the way that we think about things. So as I say here, if we take the analogy seriously, marketplaces are not about generating convergence on a particular truth or claim or something like that in a certain way. What they're really about is like constant churning and innovation and change. And so we don't know in the Hayekian sense, what a market is supposed to be doing with the price system is aggregating a bunch of diverse information and then transmitting it in various ways to people that need to know in different contexts. Schumpeter, he's arguing that the market is fundamentally a process of creative destruction that is undermining what currently exists to generate something new. This is all about kind of change that kind of never ends. And then the postural talks about this, Virginia postural talks about this as the infinite series. Some of the students who are here will have just recently read this in my class. And what we also know about marketplaces from Coase and from others is that the institutions and the rules of the marketplace really matter. Who has what rights, how we define property in this analogy. There's an analogy like this with speech, with discourse, that also really matters a lot. So the institutions of our structures of discourse are going to really matter. And so I think if we're going to take the marketplace analogy at all, we should probably take it more seriously than we do. But again, like I said earlier, the Millian kind of argument for why we would want dissent or free speech is about us, about our benefit in some sense, keeping us kind of active and fit in an epistemic sense. The marketplace analogy is more about how the system as a whole stays healthy and kind of dynamic in an important way. So again, kind of benefits of the group within the agreeing organization. Another reason that we might think that we should keep dissent alive or allow for freedom of speech, even if we all had the right answer or we could stipulate that in some fundamental sense, is I'm going to kind of take a version of this from Karl Popper, which is that we might be right in some fundamental sense, but we might only have part of the truth also in an important sense. And there might be other parts of the truth that we're not getting, or that are parts that are combined together in ways that are false, or that lead to us down kind of pointless or bad directions. So, any kind of, in the scientific sense, any kind of theory you're going to have is going to have all kinds of parts connected to it, and some of those might not be accurate, or there might be semi-inaccurate or whatever. And so what he says is that we still need to constantly churn through our kind of beliefs and our ideas in order to find the better and worse ones. And this is what he thinks, the process of science is like, and this is what he thinks an open and free society is supposed to be like fundamentally. That is, the only real way to separate the true from the false is by challenging them. We have to challenge one another on our views, and then we can try to falsify them in his sense or to undermine them. And anybody who claims that the process is over basically thinks that we can just stop where we are, but there's no reason to think that. We've often thought that in the past, and we've been wrong every time. And so the argument from a kind of an inductive sense is that we would probably be wrong now too if we were to make that inference. So again, this is about the epistemic benefits of having disagreement and freedom of speech in a society like ours. The next version has to do with, again, the kind of structure of society that bases itself on freedom of speech or on dissent or allowing this kind of thing. And so Madison has this quote here in Federalist 10 where he says basically that we can eliminate faction if we want to, or disagreement, but only by kind of eliminating the things that make a free society worth having in the first place. You see the quote here, he says, liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an ailment without instantly expire. But be not less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life because it nourishes faction, than it would be to wish for the annihilation of air. And so the point here is just that this is part of what it means to live in a free society, is to have dissent, disagreement. And he's not really saying that there's like necessarily for the epistemic benefits or the benefits in truth like Popper and maybe parts of Mill was saying. He's saying something else, that there's no real way to eliminate disagreement in an open society because to do that you have to eliminate disagreeing people or change their ideas. And maybe you have a genie to do it, but typically that's not what's going to happen. So political life in any kind of free state is going to need disagreement. And so freedom will inherently lead to disagreement, and then the only way to protect that freedom is with something like freedom of speech. At least that's one way to think about that argument. Okay. And finally we come to the last one, which is a kind of more, it's a different kind of argument. So this is the argument that I take from some thinkers like Václav Havel, the one-time prime minister of the Czech Republic and dissident in Czechoslovakia. And so he has this example, many of you will have seen it in the Power of the Powerless, where he talks about, this is in kind of Soviet-ruled Czechoslovakia at the time. He's saying that imagine there's a greengrocer, as he puts it, that puts up a sign in his shop that says, "Workers of the world unite." And he maybe agrees with it or maybe he doesn't, but that's not why he puts up the sign. He puts up the sign because he wants to show everybody that he's, going to go along to get along, that he's on the team with everybody else, that he's not going to give anybody a reason to hassle him or to make sure that he has problems, and he's going to signal to all the other shoppers and shop owners that he's a reliable member of the group. Now, the point of this example, I'm going to go a little bit deeper into it, but the point is that the sign may be true or false. Like, we may not agree, some of you may agree, but like you don't need to agree that workers of the world should unite. You can imagine all kinds of other signs that you might put in your shop or in your yard or on your Twitter handle or whatever it might be that might say this or that kind of thing. The point is, he's not saying it because he believes it, though. He's not saying it because it's important to him. He's saying it because he wants to be a member of a team, and more importantly, he wants to show that he's a reliable member of this team. So he's saying something that he doesn't believe, in this case, let's say. But even if he believed it, if the reason why he did the act was because of this other thing, then it wouldn't have been, it would still have this kind of feature. So this is a different kind of argument for why we should want to have freedom of speech, because it wasn't that the law said he had to put that sign up exactly. And you can think of analogs in our life where the law would never say that kind of thing typically. But you can imagine people doing it, and they're doing it because they think that they need to, that they think they have some reason to do it. And so that's the danger. And so Havel calls this living in truth or living a lie, basically, that this is the danger that we get into as a society, what doesn't allow and doesn't respect people's freedom to be different, to have different opinions, is we kind of force them into this kind of living a lie of bifurcating themselves into their kind of public self and their private self in a way that kind of undermines the political situation. So he has other examples of this. The point is that he says that the greengrocer who is not willing to put up the sign or takes down the sign, he's doing something very dangerous that people don't like. He's basically saying that the emperor is naked in some situation, when an emperor really is naked. So what he's doing is he's showing everyone around him not only that he doesn't agree with this thing or he doesn't believe this thing, but he's showing them that it's okay not to believe this thing. They're like, I can see what you all see. And so it's a complicated phenomenon because it might be that people think that the reason why they should go along with the thing, whatever it might be, in this case, let's say it's this kind of Soviet orthodoxy, is because everybody else believes it. But they think everybody else believes it because they see everybody putting those signs up in their shops or wearing the t-shirts or holding the banners or whatever it might be. But maybe everybody's just like the greengrocer who's doing it for the same reason, that they're worried about what everybody else thinks, or they think everybody else thinks that, but in fact they don't. And so sometimes you get these examples where people stop doing this and these things can collapse very quickly. Okay, so the point is that what I'm trying to push on now is something beyond the epistemic benefits of freedom of speech for the society as a whole. It's something more like the character of the people within that society and whether or not they can operate as free people in a different kind of sense. You can see other examples of people who have made similar claims. This is Ai Weiwei, the Chinese artist and dissident who's just recently been allowed to go back to China. And the way he puts it, I think, is nice because he says, look, it's not like I'm not afraid of doing these things, of being detained. He's been put in Chinese prison. He was not allowed to go back to his country for a long time. He says, I love freedom as much as anybody, maybe more than most people. He says, but it's a tragedy to live in fear. It's worse than actually losing your freedom. Because what he's talking about is, I think, what Havel is talking about. It's not so much the danger that we saw at the very beginning of people being put in jail or detention centers, although that's a very real danger. But it's also the danger of turning that inward and oppressing yourself before they even have a chance to do that in some fundamental sense. Okay, so what was at stake here? Remember the cases that I started out with? These were just examples that I came upon. We could give all different kinds of examples, and if I was giving this talk 6 months ago, I would have probably given very different kinds of examples, okay? Because you can point to different things in different environments. Maybe the challenge would have come from a different kind of place than it has been coming from recently. But what I think is really important about these cases is that these all happen in the United States in 2025. I think they're all in 2025. Maybe in 2026, or no, the 2021 was the Dorian. It's not important recently. The point is that these all happened in a place that has the First Amendment, like the most robust protection of freedom of speech probably anywhere in the world. So if this is what's going on here, you can imagine what's going on in other places. And in fact, you don't have to imagine what's going on in other places because we know. And so some of this is in some sense to kind of bring back the importance of freedom of speech that sometimes I think we forget because we think not only of the First Amendment, but our own history of this kind of debate and disagreement as being important. Now this leads me to a point though, because I think one of the other confusions that we have, or one of the challenges that we have, is that we think of freedom of speech in one particular way, or often in one way, or maybe one or two ways. So one way we might think about it is as a value, and I think this is what a lot of the arguments that I've been giving you think about freedom, the value of freedom of speech comes from what we get out of it. That is the epistemic benefits for ourselves in the Millian case, or maybe for the community in the marketplace, or the Popper case, or maybe like our own personal like development in some sense, or our own character in the Havel case. So the value is there. Like we want to know why free speech matters. We look to the value that freedom of speech secures for us. So that's one way to think about it. But it's not the only way because we also think of freedom of speech as a kind of norm, that is a rule or a basis that kind of leaves off, it stops certain actions from occurring. So these are like the rules that protect speech. So the First Amendment is a kind of strong norm along these lines. We have various norms of this sort at different institutions, like at a university, for instance, or wherever else, at a court, in a courthouse. So those are the rules. They can be explicit or implicit. Usually they're both, some combination of both. But then we can also think of freedom of speech as a kind of practice. That is the convention or how people act or how people expect other people to act. And you see a version of this in the Havel case that I was giving you, that he's kind of making predictions along these lines. But this is about the expectation that people will act freely, that they will exercise their freedom in certain kinds of cases, that what the done thing is in this context involves this or that, either kind of more or less freedom. And I guess going back to these points, I'll get to this point in a second. These here, in a classroom, for instance, we don't think that like maximal freedom in terms of speech is appropriate. It's not the right thing for that kind of context. So we have various rules and norms, and oftentimes they point back to the underlying value that we want to protect in terms of education or allowing people to have their point of view. Or oftentimes in a classroom, you have students who maybe don't want, maybe they're wary about expressing their point of view, so you have to kind of coax it out of them in various ways, make them feel comfortable in that context, right? But in any case, whatever the practice is what the expectations that have been developed over time. And sometimes those become norms, maybe not. And sometimes we evaluate the norms and the practice on the basis of values, of underlying values. But there's a fourth thing that I think that I'm kind of been circling around in a lot of ways, but I haven't talked about explicitly. And that's in some sense the virtue or the underlying character basis that's there when it comes to something like freedom of speech. And I think there's two that are really important that we don't talk about enough and that I think are becoming increasingly important in a lot of places, in our country and around the world. And they always have been, but I think we're starting to notice them in different ways, or at least I am. And this is freedom of speech is a kind of virtue or a set of virtues or some kind of underlying character dispositions that are important to cultivate and to be aware of. And so I can think of at least two of these that make a lot of sense to me. One is the courage to speak or defend those who are speaking, and to yourself to speak out or to think differently, and also the tolerance to listen, which I think is another important aspect of this. And they're both kind of difficult in some ways because you have to have the courage to want to be able to kind of go out on a limb and say something about what you're trying to do or what you think is true. But you also have to be willing to listen to other people. Otherwise, first of all, a lot of the benefits I talked about earlier aren't going to be in place. But also, you're not going to develop the necessary kind of muscles in the society in some sense to generate the important practices and then kind of the norms that then get at the values that we're concerned with. So what do I mean when I talk about these this courage of freedom of speech? Well, I can think of a couple examples. Here's one example that maybe some of you have seen recently. So we know what has gone down in Iran over the last several weeks, and we know the kind of danger that people like this were in when they were doing these acts and they were going out on the streets against an unjust regime. And they were doing it brazenly, and a lot of them paid the price for doing that. I mean, other examples that we can point to, and I think you don't have to go too far down the road to see the kind of the bravery and the courage that's necessary. As we can think of an example that's particularly salient in the last couple of days. We can think about Alexei Navalny. This is a still from the fairly recent Netflix documentary before his death, where he kind of gives a message at the very end. And he says, "If they decide to kill me, it means that we are incredibly strong." Of course, they did decide to kill him, and we found out yesterday through the Europeans that let us know that he was poisoned by a frog poison, of all things, by some henchmen of Putin. And then he also says that the only thing that's necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. So don't be inactive. And that is his final message in this film. And we know what happened to him. And so when I think about bravery, I think about someone like Navalny who goes out, he's protesting, he's trying to attack corruption in a regime that's obviously unjust and corrupt, and in many ways I would just say evil. And then he returns back to that country knowing the danger that he's in, knowing that he's likely to be killed for doing what he's doing, and he does it anyways. And I think if that and some of these other examples that we've seen aren't a good model of how we can think about bravery. We're not to that point in our country, and hopefully we never really will be, but the point is that each of us has a version of this kind of thing, and even the greengrocer has a version of this kind of thing, on the micro level. It's just something to think about, I think, at the personal level, in addition to the societal level or the political level. So when I think about what free speech is for, one thing it's for, I think ultimately, I think Madison is right, I think all these other people are right. We want to keep the challenges open. We need to be able to disagree with one another productively, and we need to be able to challenge political, social, cultural power. But the other part is that, as I wanted to kind of suggest, that free speech is an important value and it has values associated with it, but we need these rules and norms to secure it. So we can't just think about the value of free speech, that is the goods that we get out of it. We also have to think about the rules and the norms that help secure it. And sometimes those things don't look like freedom, I guess is what I would want to say here is the point. Like sometimes rules are going to restrict, they're always going to restrict certain kinds of behavior. But that doesn't mean that the point of them is not to enhance the ultimate value of freedom. They may or may not. Part of the reason why I want to raise this is because when we're thinking about these questions about in this or that case, we need to think about the value, of course, but that doesn't tell us everything that we need to know because we need to think about how those work in terms of rules and norms that can be applied in various institutional contexts where they're going to actually do what we want them to do, that is protect the values that we care about. And then the third part is that, as I say here, defending it is a kind of practice. That it means it involves us behaving a certain way and having certain kinds of shared expectations about each other's behavior, which is a practice in both the kind of sense, the technical sense, but also in the sense that you need to practice it. And I think that in one sense, what we try to do in the classroom, I think oftentimes, is to try to practice this kind of thing, to show what it looks like to do this well. Or at least I think that's what is happening in a classroom that's working well, in a university that's working well. And then finally, I just think that there is this thing that we sometimes, we want to create, or at least I'm guilty of this myself, is a certain kind of way of thinking that we want to set up the rules of the society, we want to set up the law, we want to look at the First Amendment or whatever it is, or the rules of the university and say, okay, now that we have those in place the right way, things will just kind of work. And that's probably true to some extent, but we still need to remind people what it takes to kind of to do the right thing and what the right thing looks like in many of these contexts. And so I used some of these examples earlier to show you not exactly how you should live your life on an everyday basis, but just to show you certain people who are willing to kind of put everything on the line for some of these values. And hopefully we won't be required to do that, but in any case, it's worth thinking about their example. So I will leave it there, and I think we have plenty of time for questions, so thank you. Oh, so raise your hand, I will call on you, and typically we want to call on students first, so if you have something you want to raise or a question, feel free. Yeah, go ahead.
I guess given the altercation that occurred at last week's event, are there any concerns that you have about the Chase Center's current free speech norms, given that you're joining the faculty next fall?
Well, I mean, I think there's a difference, as I said earlier, between norms and the practice and that kind of thing. I don't think there's really, I think our norms are probably the same as everywhere else. Now, whether or not everything happens according to the norms is a different story altogether. But no, I'm not worried about the institution, if that's what you're asking. I've not seen anything that would lead me to believe there's a problem with the people, most of them, or the rules as they're in place. Now, sometimes things happen that you don't expect or don't want, but whether or not that happened in this case is I'm not sure. But no, I'm not worried about it, in my case at least. So, yeah. Does anybody else have a question? Yeah, go ahead.
I took a class on your book last semester, and I just had a question about your game theory and public goods.
Okay.
In context to freedom of speech, which you could contextualize as a public good, would you say in a country as restrictive as Russia or Iraq, it's rational to defend people's freedom of speech at that level of context?
I mean, I think there's a lot of ways to answer that question and think about that question. And in some ways, like the example I was trying to give, the Havel-based example, is kind of along those lines, because what you have is a kind of coordination problem, a collective action problem, where you could defend freedom of speech, but what you're really defending is like, let's find out who the people are who are going to pop their heads up, and then we're just going to chop them off. That'll be an easy way to identify what dissent looks like in this kind of society. So there is definitely a collective action problem in those kinds of societies. And so, yeah, this is where I think, going back to what I was talking about earlier, I don't think just looking at the norms, we could institute a law like I think the Soviet Constitution had, vast protections for freedom of speech in it. But if it's not embodied in the practice, then that's not going to really be valuable in that sense. So, yeah, so I think if you're thinking about what to do in those kind of societies, you have to be careful. On the other hand, there is a lot of evidence that sometimes what's going on in these societies is, and I think the behavior of some of the leaders of these societies is indicative of this, which is that a lot of what's going on is people think that everybody else agrees with the system when in fact they are just like like you are, right? So this is a case of what we sometimes call like pluralistic ignorance. So if you're in the classroom, as sometimes you are, and I ask you, okay, does anybody have any questions? Like I'm going over something maybe difficult and I ask you, do you have any questions? And you look around and you notice nobody's raising their hand. You think, well, everybody else has got this figured out. So I'm not gonna raise my hand because I'm gonna look like a dum-dum. But in fact, everybody is looking around and thinking the same thing that you're thinking, right? And if one person were to raise their hand, maybe a bunch of people would, and it would kind of break the spell in some sense. And so that can happen sometimes in societies like this. There's examples of this where you get these cascades of opinion change that can happen very quickly, oftentimes for this reason. Sometimes not. It depends on what the underlying situation is. The problem is you can't really tell because people are hiding their views, and so we don't really know what's in place. But I'm not sure, did I answer your question, do you think? Okay, thanks. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Going back to your point about the masses, we should adopt kind of that courage to, challenge and show dissent. I think a big hurdle for people in that regard is that, not that they're necessarily afraid of their opinions, but that they're worried or concerned about the reactions or the productivity of that discourse in general. Like for example, at my family gatherings, we already have a rule of no politics, no political discussions, not because we know over time that it's become unproductive. Like there will be no civil discourse that emerges from that. So I guess my suggestion would be, how would you, or no, my question would be, how would you suggest the masses adopting that propensity for civil discourse over just chaos? That makes sense.
Well, I think this is a good point, and I mean, I'm glad you asked it because I want to make sure I clarify the point here, because I don't think that like we should just go around yelling our opinions about everything all the time, right? Or like, and maybe in your family, I mean, I don't know about your family, but I know in some families, maybe mine sometimes, like, it's just not appropriate to talk about certain kinds of things in certain kinds of contexts, right? How do we know what's appropriate? Well, it's a little tricky, right? You have to know about the people and everything. And so you might go to, there's all kinds of places where you shouldn't, talk about various things, religion, politics, football, whatever it might be that's going to make people angry. And so, so in any case, you have to know about that. So that, some of that's going to involve the norms, the explicit norms of the situation that you're in. Sometimes you're just not allowed to talk about certain kinds of things. But in other cases, it's going to involve the kind of the conventions, the practice of whatever situation you're in. And these things evolve over time. And the question really I think that we should ask is like, what's the why? Why do we have these rules? Is it to try to make us shut up and like we don't want you to be able to kind of think this way or talk this way? Or is it like for group harmony, or so we can do something else like have Thanksgiving, right? Like that's what we're trying to do here, is like have Thanksgiving, not necessarily argue about everything. Maybe that's the case. But like sometimes it is like appropriate to raise these things, right? So knowing that is difficult. And I think I'm not trying to, I don't have an algorithm for figuring this out in every case, but I guess what I'm trying to suggest at the very end is that by looking at the various ways that we think about the value and the structure of our free speech institutions and claims, we can hopefully try to triangulate some of these things by pointing to where the action is in this particular case. Is it because we're silencing people who have opinions that they need to be heard, or we're trying to shut people up because we don't want to allow a conversation on this? Or is it because this is just, really not the time and place for this kind of thing, right? I mean, on the university, we have various restrictions on when you can do this or that kind of, say, protest or have this kind of speech. This is true in society at large. But so long as there's some kind of avenue that's available to everyone in that kind of context, I think most of the time we think that that's acceptable. So there are various analogs to this. But again, I don't think that free speech just means everybody should be saying all kinds of stuff all the time. Like that's exactly what I'm not saying, because I do think that there are going to be differences in terms of the structure of the institution and the practices that you're in. So that said, I think we do have a wide latitude for protection in this country and in most places. And I think we also have, in general, a practice of being pretty open about it for the most part, which is maybe not true in all places. So again, I'm not sure if I answered your question. I can't tell you what to talk about at Thanksgiving, but I do think that discretion is the better part of valor oftentimes with your family members. So. Yeah.
It's often said that a truly tolerant society cannot tolerate intolerance. And I think that this, in the modern day, is a very pertinent question, is to what extent can things like hate speech be considered free speech? And at what point do you draw the line? I'd just like to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the question, is where to draw the line. Now, of course, in the United States, like, we have kind of, because of the First Amendment, it's very difficult to have, legislation, for instance, that bans hate speech of the sort that some European countries have, for instance, although you can have versions of this. But that's not really what you're asking. I guess what you're asking is the larger question, which I think, Karl Popper has a version of this where he talks about the paradox of toleration, where it's, you tolerate, he's thinking in particular, he's from Austria before the war, and he's thinking in particular, you have a society that allows Nazis to go around demonstrating and having their, at a certain point you can try to talk to them, but this seems, counterproductive, and you're putting yourself in a bad situation. So what that looks like on the ground, I think is going to be very different. There is going to be a limit to this on some level. He points it out. Some of the students will know, we read a piece on this recently in class by Karl Popper, and he thinks it happens when the reasonable discussion goes away, and you're talking about people are pointing guns in your face and telling you to do this or that kind of thing. I don't think that he would be comfortable with the as wide as we have drawn the line here in the United States, for instance. I mean, so like the classic case in Skokie, Illinois, where Nazis are marching in Illinois, they're doing this specifically to offend and anger the Jewish population, many of whom were Holocaust survivors in that area, right? So they're not doing it for any kind of epistemic point or whatever. All the stuff I talked about earlier, that's not the point. They're doing it just for their own benefit, to gain attention, and to anger people that they don't like, right? So I think in many cases, probably Popper would not be as comfortable with that as, at least in the United States, we've kind of allowed that kind of thing. And so, but I guess the question is, how do we know when to draw the line? And that's the question that I would want to ask, is how would you go about answering that question? And I think the only way you could really go about answering that question is going back to thinking about what the values are that we want to protect, and then what kinds of rules that we can look to, or norms, can protect those kinds of things. And what do I mean by that? I mean, like, should the rules be general? Should they be, neutral with regard to content? Like the kinds of things that we ask about the rules that we put in place, and then we can start to think about how this makes sense in the particular context. I don't know that you're going to be able to get a kind of generalized answer to this kind of thing, but I do think that I would want to push the line out basically as far as we could go until we started to endanger the values, either the values that we think we're trying to support with freedom of speech itself, or maybe some other very weighty value in the society. Any other questions or thoughts? No, we got it worked out? Yeah.
I'm sure most of us are aware of, as with the recent rollbacks of diversity, equity, inclusion programs in Ohio, and specifically at Ohio State. I was just wondering, do you believe that free speech includes the right to institutional support for those perspectives, or just the right to express them privately? And
Well, that's a tricky question. I mean, there's a difference between institutional support, state mandates, there's all kinds of things. So I think the tricky point is that you have various kinds of rules going in one direction, saying that you have to do this or that, that can restrict people's speech and action in one way. Sometimes you have a countervailing pressure that goes in a different direction. It might be that there's rules that are put in place, but the point of them is to increase freedom. This goes back to the point earlier. Now, whether or not they accomplish that goal is a different question, but I do think that insofar as that's the aim, that can be a beneficial thing. So whether or not those things should be allowed in an institution setting, of course, people should be allowed to talk about these things institutionally, which I believe that they are. What the policy of an organization should be is a different kind of question. I'm not sure if that exactly answered your question, but that's at least how I kind of think about it. Anybody else have any other questions? Yeah?
Thanks, John. You spoke at one point about, I think the phrase you used was coaxing it out of students and trying to get students to express their opinions and learning to express their opinions. I was wondering if, just giving you an opportunity to kind of reflect a little bit more, say a little bit more about how the classroom is a space where students, by learning that, are learning a civic virtue. And I just wanted to sort of throw that at you and then just hear your thoughts, because it seemed like you had something gesturing in that direction that,
Right.
I don't know.
Well, I think so. And so, again, my background is in philosophy and in that kind of teaching, where a lot of what we're trying to do is get people to consider potentially strange views, views that go outside of their comfort zone. We want them to be able to kind of like play around with those so that we can kind of have a productive kind of argument to try to do this kind of Socratic method of challenging the views and then getting them to figure out ways to defend them and that kind of thing. And that can be difficult at first if you're not used to doing that, partly because it involves the professor in one case, raising objections to the student, trying to kind of get them to have better arguments or go in a particular direction or whatever it might be. But oftentimes it's also about the students doing that with each other or back at you, right? Like trying to kind of push you, and that's an important part of the process too. And there's a way of doing that that's productive and that's respectful and that works fundamentally in a classroom. And I think that's what we're trying to teach the students to do. Partly, I think, I'll just say this as a slightly aside, but one good way to do this, I think, though, is also to have professors in the room together who they can see doing this to each other sometimes, and sometimes even pretty aggressively, but like in a respectful way. So they can kind of see like this is okay, like to do this kind of thing. Because I think even though maybe we don't think this way, I think sometimes the students will be differential in ways that maybe they shouldn't be in terms of when we're having these kind of discussions. So I guess the larger point is just I do think that it's a kind of microcosm in an important way, and I think that's beyond what substance that we're teaching in the classroom, which is often very important, of course. I think it's this kind of method of disagreeing productively and respectfully that really can kind of translate into all different kinds of environments, especially to the civic environment, politics, and then we'd like to see more of that, of course, I think. But also to the workplace, other places as well, where I think people need to be comfortable raising objections, raising challenges, bringing up new points, but doing so in a way that's, going to be respectful and going to be productive in the end. So I don't know if that gets exactly at your point, but I do agree with that, yeah.
Thanks for this, really interesting. So I was very interested in, and you could say more about this, about your argument that we don't take the marketplace metaphor seriously enough. And one way of thinking, because I think in some ways it's hard to disagree with a lot of these perspectives, which are fundamentally liberal, like not in a left versus right, but a classic liberal sense. But it struck me that there is, I'd be curious to see how you react to this, especially the invocation of someone like Schumpeter raises this question, which is if the marketplace, according to the idea of creative destruction, is actually in some ways incentivizing and accelerating a process in which every view, and you're incentivized to come up like, how can I think of whatever X view is, how can I take this down? How can I get a competitive advantage by going against this? It seems that may be in tension or is in tension potentially with other kinds of like a virtue perspective or a Madisonian perspective in which the point is, you want to have liberty to allow people to express their different views. We're going to have people with different views. But that's a different question with thinking of this in terms of a structure which is actually constantly accelerating the erosion of some views that many people may not want to have, sort of relentlessly challenged in that way. So just curious if you could talk either about that marketplace metaphor a little bit more, or about the potential tension between the values embedded in that metaphor and some of the other ways you have of defending free speech.
I have a lot to say about the market metaphor. That was originally what I was going to talk about completely tonight, actually, but recognizing time, I'll come to the point that I think that you're pushing at the end, which is this point about creative destruction, maybe, like in the marketplace, and then how that applies maybe in terms of the culture or the society that's built, that we have free speech to be concerned with, right? Politics, culture, all these things. And I think one reason why I wanted to raise this is I think it's an important thing to take into account of, and I don't know where it goes exactly completely, but I do think that the phenomenon you point out is a real one, and it's important to note it because I think sometimes we think the Millian marketplace of ideas is going to work like science or something, where it's going to, through this contestation and open process, we're going to lead to convergence on truth or something like that. But that's not how the marketplace works. Like, we have a vast array of all kinds of things. There's no one thing in the market where there's tons of them. right? And what Schumpeter's saying and what Postel says in a different way is that we're just going to take that thing and then keep iterating and finding new ways to do it. And you see this online, right? The internet has done this. I think social media has done this, where we're now living in this kind of Leibnizian world of ideas where like any idea that you can imagine exists, right? Like somebody holds this idea and is articulating it with some group online, right? And that may not be a good thing in the end, I don't know, but we've had similar versions of this in the past, and you know, in terms of when new technology has led to a proliferation of views and more debate. These were turbulent times. I'm thinking of the invention of the printing press in particular, but you can think of others like the invention of radio certainly had something to do with the rise of authoritarian regimes in Europe. So in any case, what I do want to say is I don't want to be Panglossian about this. Like, this is not about that everything will kind of work out exactly the way we want, which is precisely why I need to think, going back to the marketplace metaphor, we don't just think about the market, kind of we set it up and we just let it run. We think about what kind of rules, what kind of rights, what kind of structures allow markets to work better or worse. How do we understand that? I mean, to some extent, this is like what economics, political economy is really about, thinking through. And also, going back to the beginning, like my kind of interest in PPE is trying to bring some of these other concerns from, you know, ethics, philosophy, politics, to kind of try to think through some of these questions as they relate to economics, but also maybe to the analogy in terms of thought and speech. So thanks for that. That's a good question. So. Yeah, sure. Did you have a?
Hi. So I really like the talk and fully on board with the conclusions, especially I like the progression from values down to virtues and the steps in between. What I was curious about is the front end setup and two aspects of it. One, the sort of appeal to after the revolution or the genie analogy, which seems to be, you know, stipulating away fallibility and finitude. But then the logic of the argument seems to hinge on fallibility and finitude. And that I'm not just trying to play a game of gotcha, because it seems to me that one of the virtuous commitments is even when we think that we're beyond fallibility and finitude, that we're committed to the humility that keeps fallibility and finitude in the picture. And I didn't see how the logic of your argument goes through if we stipulate those away. I wasn't sure what you're going for. And similarly, the three examples are arresting and disturbing, but you mentioned that you don't think they've run afoul of the First Amendment, which you also stipulated was the most expansive or powerful sort of legal protection, and yet it's the state in two of the three cases that were, I'll use the word perpetrating, that silencing. And so I couldn't follow how were you suggesting we need more than the First Amendment, or in the third case, private regulation of private power, or is that where the virtue part comes in?
Yeah, so it's a lot there, but addressing the last part of the question first, I would just say that, yeah, what I was trying to suggest was that the First Amendment, as powerful as it is and as important as it is a set of, you know, one kind of super rule that kind of has a variety of other kind of underlying rules and norms associated with it, it doesn't do the job on its own. Like, you need other things, and so what are some of those other things? How do they operate? That's kind of what I was trying to suggest. And in terms of the genie case, right, what I was suggesting there, I think you hit on the nail on the head there, which is like, it's not about fallibility, right? It's supposed to be, and so this kind of going to the Havel case, imagine that he actually really does think that the workers of the world should unite, right? But the reason that he's doing it is not for that reason, then there's still something lost in that case, right? Because, and that's what I'm trying to suggest. Now, there's another question about if you choose to have the genie implement her plan or her wish, that says something about you too, that you should think about for a second, and why it's bad if it's bad, or, you know, and so we could talk more about that. But yes, what I was trying to suggest is there's something kind of even left, there's a remainder at the end, even if we don't think that fallibility is the issue, even if someone would agree with the things that they go along with, that having that choice, having that kind of friction is important in a society, even without that. So now your mileage may vary on that, but that's at least what I'm trying to get at. So.
Well, please join me in thanking John.
Yeah, thank you.